Hello and welcome to A-Level Psychology. This is the psychodynamic approach in as close to 5 minutes as possible. So here we go. Three main assumptions of this approach. Firstly, our behaviour is influenced by unconscious forces. Secondly, early childhood is really important in that. And thirdly, it has a focus on looking at the whole person and explaining behaviour in that way. So we're going to whiz through those three things really quickly. You can obviously pause the PowerPoint if you want to take more time to read any of the concepts or information on the slides. Okay, so first off, behaviour is influenced by unconscious forces. So you'll see this iceberg picture on the slide here. We have, according to Freud, a conscious part of our mind, which is the very tip of the iceberg that's out of the water. We also have an unconscious part of our mind, which where most of our personality would fall under that. And what happens is lots of stuff goes on in there. So let's have a look at what that is. You can see here, if we break down the iceberg analogy a little bit more, Freud talked about our conscious mind being the bits we can access and that we're aware of. Our pre-conscious is bits that kind of break through, for example, in our dreams, or when we have a slip of our tongue that reveals what we're really thinking. But the largest part of our mind is actually in our unconscious, and that's where we have lots of aggressive and sexual instincts. And more on that now. So the personality has three parts: the id, the ego, and the superego, and they all conflict against each other. And the way that we resolve that affects then our conscious experience. So if it's badly resolved, it can lead to issues that we experience, which was what Freud then went and looked at in therapy, which we're not going to look at as part of this, sadly. Right. Id, ego, and superego, the three parts of our personality, according to Freud. The id is kind of like the devil on our shoulder. So the id is the part that we're born with that has all sorts of aggressive and sexual, urges. It wants instant gratification. The superego is like the angel on our other shoulder, which is like the moral part of us that develops later, that tells us what we should do, our conscience. The ego is then like the part of our personality that balances those two things out. It's the part that kind of mediates between the two of them, like a parent kind of mediating between two squabbling kids. It thinks of what should we do realistically in this situation. Right, still part of this assumption that our behaviour is influenced by our unconscious, we look in psychology A-level at something called defence mechanisms. And that is when we have these conflicts between the id, ego and the superego, and they're not properly resolved, what can happen is that can lead to issues and anxiety. So the ego then uses something called defence mechanisms to protect us against that. So let's look at some examples of that. What we have is that we need to know about in psychology at A-level is the repression, denial, and displacement. Repression is where we force a distressing memory out of our conscious mind. So, for example, if you experience something really traumatic and then you can't remember anything about it, that's an example of repression. And all of these are things that we do, or we should only do temporarily, just to allow us to come to terms with them. If they become a longer-term strategy, that's when someone would have bigger problems or mental illness, for example, according to Freud. Right, denial, the second type, is refusing to acknowledge some aspect of reality. So someone who is an alcoholic continuing to go to work and say they can function fine, so why does it matter? For example, then we have displacement, the last one, where we transfer feelings from the true source of our distressing emotion onto a substitute target. Good example of that is if a teacher tells you off at school, you can't be lash out at the teacher, so you go home and you yell at your younger sibling or something. You're transferring your feelings of anger onto someone else. Okay, so the second assumption in this approach is the psychosexual stages, childhood experiences, really matter when we're forming our personality. And actually, those base instincts that we're born with in our id, that sexual aggressive urges, what happens is as we go through our childhood, that's present but unconscious. We go through various stages. We have to resolve a sort of conflict at every stage, and they're each focused on a different stage. If we do that well, then we turn out to be a well-adjusted adult. If something goes wrong with that, perhaps due to poor parenting, then we can end up with various issues later on. So let's have a look in more detail. So what we have is the first stage, the oral stage. This is where your pleasure and your gratification is focused on your mouth. If you've ever spent any time with a baby under a year old, they put everything in their mouth. And that is really important for them to get through that stage effectively. Next, the anal stage. This is where we start looking at stuff like potty training, and the pleasure is all focused on the anus, where you have bowel movements, and the child is trying to teach the parent is trying to teach the child how to use the potty, and it's all focused on that. And you can see what can happen if that goes wrong in either way by having a read of the slide here. Then the third stage is the phallic stage, and that's where we have a focus of pleasure is on the genitals. And I'm going to come back to that one in a minute in a bit more detail. And then after that, what we have is a latency stage where nothing much happens in that. Is kind of a period of rest before then puberty hits, and we then have genital stage, where the person hopefully becomes a well-adjusted adult if all of the previous stages had been resolved well. Right, let's just go back to the phallic stage and pick up this particular bit, which is something called the Oedipus complex, which Freud said was a really important part of our sexual development. And what happens in this stage is, and this is focused on boys only, there's something different for girls that got added later, but Freud's theory is for boys, that boys will have feelings of desire for their opposite sex parent. They will then compete with their same sex parent. It puts them in competition, which they then have a fear of being found out and a fear of castration called castration anxiety. And what happens, that's the conflict that is trying to be resolved. Remember, all of this is unconscious. And unconsciously, what happens is that the boy then starts identifying with their same-sex parent. So they would adopt or internalize, imitate their father, and substitute their desire for mother with a desire for other women. So that's how that conflict is then resolved. If that conflict isn't resolved in that way for some reason, then you would end up with issues later on. Okay, the Electra complex was added later by Carl Jung, and it's kind of like a flipped over version. So the girl believes that she's been castrated and blames the mother for that and has something called penis envy. And in order to resolve that, they have to identify with their mother, but their motivation for giving up the father as a love object is less clear than on the Oedipus complex. So the suggestion is that the identification for girls is less complete than boys. Okay, it could perhaps have been better thought through, but more on that later. Okay, so we then have our third assumption, which is that the psychodynamic approach has a focus on the whole person. So it's not just looking at one element like the biological approach known as biological reductionism. You'll look at this more in your issues and debates unit, but the psychodynamic approach actually focuses on explaining the entire person, which means it's what we call a holistic approach, which is really good because it's not reducing behaviour down. And linked to that, you'll see it's supported by a number of different case studies where you focus in and look at one person in their entirety and try to understand their behaviour. So that links well together.